Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to join us on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Let me do that again, facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. You'll be able to submit questions, comments, suggest future guests. A former science and technology editor for the Economist magazine, Matt Ridley is a journalist and a best-selling author whose many books include Genome, the Autobiography of a Species in 23 chapters. Matt Ridley's most recent book, published just this year, The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. Matt Ridley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the show, Peter.
Segment 1, Ideas Having Sex. I'm going to quote, as over and over again through this program, from The Rational Optimist. Look at the hand axe and the computer mouse. One was made by a single person, the other by hundreds of people, maybe even millions. Close quote. Explain what you mean when you say the computer mouse was made by millions of people and what that has to do with your argument.
Well, unlike a stone tool made by an ancestral hominid, a computer mouse, which is exactly the same size and shape, is a confection of different substances. There's plastic and silicon and metal in there, but it's a confection of different ideas too. Ideas, the idea of computing, the idea of plastic, the idea of all these things have come together in it. It embodies those ideas. Now, how do ideas get to come together and join, to meet and to mate in that way? Well, it turns out that there needs to be a process for that to happen. In biology, my body's also a confection of ideas, the idea of genes, the idea of brains, etc. You know, they're all inventions that have occurred to an ancestral species. How did evolution make me a cumulative confection of ideas? It used sex. Sex is what enables you to draw upon the inventiveness of the whole species because it enables ideas to cross from one lineage to another. So there's a process in human history that has the same impact, and that we had culture, we had imagination, we had big brains. They didn't really change our status as just another ape with a bit of technology until suddenly we had exchange. And the habit of swapping one thing for another had the same impact on our cultural development. Suddenly it began to explode as the invention of sex had in biology. So that's why I say ideas having sex is the secret behind human progress.
Once again, the Rational Optimist. Human progress has been a good thing, and the world is as good a place to live as it has ever been for the average human being. Richer, healthier, and kinder, too. So this is where the optimism comes in.
That's right.
The book has been out for 6 or 7 months now. Have you had any occasion to retreat from that assertion?
Well, soon after the book came out, it contains the claim that the amount of oil spilled in the ocean is down 90% since the 1970s. Well, there was a big oil spill almost immediately after the book came out. But, you know, the trend is still there. On average, we're spilling less oil in the ocean. The numbers really astound me. And no, I haven't had to retreat from any of them because I keep getting more examples. I heard just last week, for example, that Steven Pinker was telling me that the 2000s looks like it's the decade with the lowest number of war deaths for 150 years at least. Now, we find that surprising in the West because we've been involved in some wars in the 2000s and we weren't before that. But globally, the number of people killed in wars is down. And per capita income is trebled in my lifetime. Child mortality is down by 2/3 in my lifetime. Lifespan is up by 1/3. We're adding lifespan globally. This is talking about the whole world, not just in the West. We're adding lifespan at the rate of 5 hours a day. It's an extraordinary achievement. Of course, there are things going in the wrong direction.
I suppose it would not be correct to interpret that as meaning that I could sleep 5 hours more each day. That's the first. Sorry about that. So, Matt, what I want to know is when you sit down to write The Rational Optimist, which is this, for a book that's as thick as it is wonderfully readable. I'd like to assert that for readers right now.
Thank you.
Who is in your mind as someone whom you must rebut? What are you pushing against?
When I was a student in the 1970s, I was told that the future of the world was bleak. The grown-ups told me that. They told me the population explosion was unstoppable. There was a cancer epidemic caused by chemicals in the environment that was going to kill us off. The desert was advancing. The oil was going to run out. I don't remember anyone telling me actually, we could be on the verge of 3 decades of faster economic growth, more reduction in poverty, more reduction in ill health and hunger, more democratization than at any period in history. And yet that's what actually happened. So I'm writing this kind of to a version of myself 30 years ago, saying, here's the book I wish I'd been able to read in the 1970s.
You talk about being educated in the 70s. You're talking about university in Britain? All right. So let me just introduce for you, you and I are roughly the same age, the American experience, where we have President Jimmy Carter talking about limits to growth, the Club of Rome talking again about the whole notion of small is beautiful, economies must get smaller. Paul Ehrlich, a professor right here at Stanford to this very day, predicting famine, mass die-offs in the population. This is what you're talking about in the 70s as well.
Exactly.
It's in the air throughout the Western world.
I mean, we're hearing all those examples, and Paul Ehrlich, for example, is specifically predicting that lifespan in the West is going to drop to 42 years by the end of the 20th century, instead of which it continued to rise. There was no great cancer epidemic.
All right, segment 2, let's go on and let's delve down a little bit more deeply into the evidence. Once again, that summary argument of yours that life for, quote, the average human being is richer, healthier, and kinder. Let's take each of those in turn. Healthier. Evidence.
Healthier lifespan, but also the retreat of, for example, waterborne diseases, which have almost entirely vanished as a cause of death in the US. Malaria, huge retreat. Hasn't retreated far enough. It's still killing 1 million people a year, but it used to kill people in Russia and America and all over Asia as well. So a lot of those kind of diseases. Heart disease, declining pretty steadily. Cancer, if you correct for age, is not going up. In fact, it's slightly going down.
Oh, really?
Of course, we're living longer, and so we're more likely to encounter cancer, because cancer is something that gets more common as you get older. But if correcting for that factor, cancer is not getting commoner. So there are all sorts, and the other thing is, people think, well, okay, we've expanded lifespan, but only at the expense of a lot of painful and miserable years at the end of life. Actually, that's not true. Go and talk to most people in their 80s. They're having a great time. Now, sure, at some point, you start suffering, but the evidence is that we're compressing morbidity, that we're spending a longer time...
The truly miserable bit comes at the tail end now.
Exactly, and we're spending a longer time living and a shorter time dying.
I see.
Now, that's not true for someone with Alzheimer's or something like that, but it is true for most people.
That's healthier. Life today is richer.
Well, per capita income is the easiest measure here. In real terms, it's trebled for the average citizen of the world. Since I was born, since the late 1950s. In other words, in about 50 years. I'm 52 years old. The enrichment of China is really the most extraordinary demographic and economic phenomenon, and indeed India, because that has meant that not only is the world getting more prosperous, there are more people joining the middle class, etc., but it's meant that the world is getting less unequal. It's getting more equal. You can measure inequality. And inequality is probably increasing in China because some people are getting very rich, and it may be increasing in this country. But it's decreasing globally because the Chinese are getting richer faster than the Americans, if you see what I mean.
I see.
The poor people are getting richer faster than the rich people at the moment. That's
Matt, there's an absolutely fascinating, I think, set of illustrations here from the Rational Optimist, in which you say, quote, this is what prosperity is, the increase in the amount of goods or services you can earn with the same amount of work, close quote. And then you go on and give the example of how long took humans in various epochs to work to produce 1 hour of artificial light.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
I do. I've got that in my head.
Can you take us through that?
Today.
I love it too, I have to say.
If you start with today and go backwards,
right.
Today the average American on the average wage has to work for half a second to afford an hour of reading light from a compact fluorescent bulb. That's roughly the equation. Back in 1950, you had to work for 8 seconds with an incandescent bulb, with the then price of electricity, with the then average wage. In 1880, it was 15 minutes that you had to work, with a kerosene lamp, exactly. And in 1800, it was 6 hours that you had to work. You had to work 6 hours to afford a candle in 1800, on the average wage. So we're not talking about rich people. Rich people could have candles burning in their houses, but ordinary people couldn't. They couldn't afford candles. I mean, if you go right back to Babylon, these numbers, by the way, come from William Nordhaus, the Economist. If you go right back to a sesame oil lamp in Babylon. I can't remember the number, but it's
50 hours.
50 hours.
50 hours. 50 hours to grow the sesame and crush it and all of that.
Exactly.
Right.
And of course, it would take you that long now if you wanted to make light from scratch. If you wanted to go and kill a sheep and turn it into a candle, or grow some sesame or whatever. That's how long it would take you. So the reduction in the amount of time to fulfill a need is the real measure of prosperity. That's what I'm arguing. Time is the crucial ingredient.
Right. Matt, the third of these attributes, life is kinder. That's harder to argue, isn't it? Go ahead.
Well, I think it is. Look at charitable giving. It's rising faster than GDP in countries like the US and the UK. Look at homicide. Your chances of being a victim of homicide were about 10 times what they are now in Europe in the Middle Ages. It's been declining steadily ever since. Look at the kinds of things that we don't tolerate nowadays that we thought routine before: slavery, racial prejudice, gender prejudice. We're much less tolerant of unkindness now, and that's a measure of how much nicer we are. On the whole, there's an awful lot wrong with life, but it's not that unkind compared with what it was in the past.
Compared with what it was in the past. All right. Recurring question. I have one version or another of this question in virtually every segment in my notes here. What is everybody complaining about? You write, here in this country, we hear over and over and over again about the plight of the poor. This is a kind of trope on the evening news and in the newspapers. The New York Times, there's something about the poor on the front page every single day, particularly during the recession. And you write in the Rational Optimist, quote, "Today, of Americans officially designated as poor, 99% have electricity, running water, flush toilets, and a refrigerator. 95% have a television, 88% a telephone, 71% a car, and 70% air conditioning," close quote. So, how is it? What is going on that we seem to be stuck with these political tropes that are decades out of date?
Well, partly we're interested in relative wealth. And so we adjust what we mean by poor. We say, you're now considered poor even if you've got a car or whatever, which would have been ridiculous in the early years of the 20th century. And partly, of course, as I say, we're getting kinder, and so that means we want to show our kindness, and one of the ways of showing our kindness is to show concern about the fact that some people are not as well off as others. So it doesn't reflect badly that we talk about this, but it just means that we keep forgetting to notice the improvement. Now, why does that matter? Because I think in order to be ambitious to make improvements in the future, you have to understand that it's possible. You have to look around, look at the recent past and say, my goodness, actually, we've dragged a lot of people up the income scale in the last 30 or 40 years. We're not doing badly. That means let's do it again. Let's drag them even further up the income scale.
All right, segment 3. Well, you've provided the evidence. Now, how did it happen? Take the down to the turning wheels in your argument. The Rational Optimist. Barter was the trick that changed the world. Elaborate on that.
In the end, the secret of human society compared with other animals, and the reason we're able to experience something called prosperity in the first place, is that we work for each other. That is to say, I do what I'm good at, and I share what I'm good at with other people, and they in exchange share what they're good at with me. So we specialize as producers, and we generalize as consumers. We're more diverse in what we consume because we're more specialized in what we produce. That's the sort of grand theme that's been playing out over human history, and sometimes it advances and sometimes it retreats, but on the whole it's been getting more and more, so that we get more and more specialized in the way we do things. And that only works if you share, if you exchange, if you barter. And so I'm interested in when that barter trick was invented, because once we started saying, oh, you and your tribe, you have a lot of fish, we have a lot of bananas, we're sick of bananas, can we have some of your fish? We'll give you some of our bananas. And then we're both better off for the exchange. It's a non-zero-sum game. And then we go back and we say, well, actually, we don't need to go fishing in our rather bad river. We'll just grow bananas. We'll get all our fish from those guys, etc. So it can breed upon itself. I want to know when that began, because that's very odd. No other animals pulled that trick off, except within ant colonies and things, but they have to stay within the colony. It doesn't work, they can't work for strangers in ants. And it looks like that habit began 100,000 years ago, give or take some tens of thousands of years, we're not sure, because that's when you first start seeing human artifacts moving long distances. You see beads and tools starting to travel inland from the sea or over long distances from a volcanic source or something like that, and that means trade. That means people are starting to move them hand to hand.
Another layer of your argument, again from the Rational Optimist. According to the anthropologist Joe Henrich, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, human beings learn skills from each other by copying prestigious individuals, and they innovate by making mistakes that are very occasionally improvements. That's how culture evolves. The bigger the connected population, the more skilled the teacher, and the bigger the probability of a productive mistake, close quote. From which, question mark, it follows that we should cherish population growth, the development of cities, and now with technology, this new interconnectedness of the entire globe. That's all good.
Yes, is the short answer. Now, I'll just raise one question mark over population growth. It's absolutely true that the more people you have and the better they're communicating, the faster technology moves. We can see this clearly in the historical pattern. Countries with very sparse populations like Australia see a slower development of technology in the Stone Age. I'm not talking about today. In the Pacific, you see some islands, the bigger the population of the island or the more connected the island, the more diverse their technology, etc. So technology depends on a collective brain, not an individual brain. It doesn't mind how clever we are. It just minds how well we're communicating and how well we're trading and exchanging. And that, of course, is why cities works, because they're places where people do communication a lot. And most innovation comes out of cities these days. And that, of course, means that the internet, which is a massive collective brain, is accelerating the rate of innovation. I think there's no doubt about that. It can't not be, because we're not only connecting our brains, we're now connecting our computers. They're no longer limited by their own power. They're connected to a network. It's a network effect. That said, I'm not convinced that going from 6.8 billion people to 9 billion people, as we will during the century, will make much difference in that respect. I suspect 6.8 billion is a big enough collective brain, depending on how well they're communicating.
I will return to population in a moment,
Yeah.
but I want to take one final step in your argument here. You argue in the Rational Optimist not only that this interconnectedness, the barter, the openness to commerce, not only does it make us richer, healthier, but it also makes us better. Quote, there is a direct link between commerce and virtue. So, as Gordon Gekko, so Matt Ridley, greed is good.
Well, I didn't say greed was good. I think one of the problems is that greed often means trying to get too much out of an exchange, not being fair, not leaving something on the table, if you like. And I have a problem with the difference between two kinds of markets. There's commerce markets where, how you get your toothpaste and your hamburgers and your haircuts in everyday life, which is a commercial market,
right.
and whether you're speculating on the value of assets, which is essentially financial markets, etc. Whether you're buying something in order to hope that it goes up in price rather than simply to use it.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think those markets don't work so well. And
the speculative markets.
The speculative markets, because I think they're prone to bubbles and crashes, and this is what we've just recently seen. But luckily, when those bubbles pop, they can do surprisingly little harm to the general process of the commercial market.
Matt, but I want to clear up the direct link between commerce and virtue. Are you arguing, and frankly, I wasn't sure from the book, are you arguing that because of commerce, the end result looks virtuous? That is to say, people are better off. It looks as though they're the benevolence of the hidden hand, to use Adam Smith's phrase. Or are you actually arguing that to engage in commerce develops habits of fairness, empathy with others, that it does truly make us, according to the Judeo-Christian range of values, better human beings?
I think I am arguing both those propositions, as it were, because if you look at, if you can actually take some of these bargaining games that economists have developed in experimental economics, and you can ask people in pre-state societies, hunter-gatherers and things like that, to play them. And it turns out that the more contact people have with commercial markets, the more money they leave on the table in these interactions, the more they realize that if fairness is important. That actually, in some sense, markets train us to be, if you're running a stall selling bread, you learn pretty quickly that it's not a good idea to insult your customers or kill them or that kind of thing. And so the more people get embedded in commerce, the nicer they behave in all these old virtuous ways. And that's something that a lot of religious leaders, I think, have forgotten. And they tend to argue that we're nice despite commerce rather than because commerce.
Right.
And of course, I'm not saying that people operate in markets in order to do good. The reason a guy sells me lunch is not because he thinks, I'd like to do this guy a favour. But he is doing me a favour. And this is Adam Smith's great insight, is that most of the good that's done in the world is actually done by people who are not intending to do good, but they do it anyway.
Segment 4, the problem of the 20th century. Now I hit you with a criticism. Stephen Malanga, in a review of the Rational Optimist that he published in the City Journal, and I'm quoting him, consider one glaring omission from the Rational Optimist. The problem of the years 1914 to 1989, 2 world wars that killed some 70 million people, the rise of Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Japanese militarism, the Holocaust and the Cold War. What is the theory of progress that explains why the very people who are prospering from the Industrial Revolution and the rise of democracy plunged themselves into such destructive confrontations? That is a problem.
It's a good question. And it's happened before, and it'll happen again. That is to say, the prosperity produced by trade and commerce will produce regimes that then use that prosperity to wage war either on their own subjects or on somebody else's subjects, etc. It's a common... I regard it as a form of sort of parasitism it's a flea on the back of the thing that's doing good. In other words, human beings have always had 2 ways of prospering. One is to engage in trade, and the other, to grow things and make things and swap them. And the other is to simply steal, to plunder.
Right.
And you can do that either by becoming a king or becoming a thief or some such version, or even a bureaucrat, actually.
Well, so now what I want to do, Matt, is suggest your sequel to this book. Because you're pretty careful in The Rationalist Optimist. Actually, you're not careful to avoid the subject. I think it just doesn't interest you per se in this book. And that's politics.
Yeah.
Because I reckon I'm pretty willing to argue, even on only having read the book once, I'm pretty willing to argue that it suggests a classically liberal point of view. Adam Smith was the first rational optimist of whom I'm aware. You're arguing, in effect, I think, I'm putting this to you for your comment, you're arguing, look, if we can have free markets and limited government, we get this cornucopia of activity, of goods and services, of virtues being developed, but we must resist tyrannical government. We must resist a kind of throwback to the old tribal, the Volk of Hitler, or the right. So you this is pretty much, this is an argument for limited government. You're a Tea Party man. You just haven't been told that yet. What do you reckon?
Well, to some extent, yes. I think that there's an old-fashioned human nature in us that wants to stab people in the back and plunder. And we find various ways of keeping that under control. And if you look at the story of the 20th century, do you end up concluding that there was too much government or too little government in the 20th century? And, after a century with Mao and Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mugabe and Mobutu and et cetera, against that you can set Somalia, too little government. Not even Haiti, though. Haiti had Papa Doc,
Right, much too much.
It's hard to think of examples of countries that had too little government in the 20th century, whereas there are far more examples of countries that had too much. So, yes, I do think that too much government is a much bigger risk than a lot of people in the intelligentsia are prepared to admit.
All right, but another complication here. I just want to see how you respond to this. You've already stated how dramatically life has improved just in your lifetime and mine from the 1950s to the present. But Here are other things that have happened, at least in the United States, between the 1950s and the present. The divorce rate has doubled. The rate of illegitimate births has risen from about 5% in 1950 to almost 40% today. So we may be richer in all kinds of ways, but in every way that family life enriches us. You just can't say the illegitimacy rate among blacks and Hispanics is, you just can't say that a child born into a home where he's unlikely ever to get to know his father, or where there are unlikely to be two parents until the age of 18, you just can't say that's an improvement over 5 decades ago, can you? So how do you handle that?
Yeah, well,
these social pathologies, there are bits of life that seem to be getting worse, right?
I mean, on the whole, I'm a social liberal as well as an economic liberal.
Right.
You know, I'm somebody. You know, the culture wars of the '60s are about people who don't like the social implications of these economic changes, and people who don't like the economic changes but do like the social changes. I actually like both.
All right. So
and
you
I
don't
think,
mind the
well,
kind of dissolution of the family.
Let me get to your point, but I mean, you know, so I think it's good that people can get divorced if they're in unhappy marriages. I think it's good that they can come out if they're gay and all these kind of things. But has that led to other problems? Yes, it clearly has. And I think the illegitimacy point is one you raise, although to some extent, you know, if it's two parents who haven't yet got married but are living in a loving relationship, I don't have a problem with illegitimacy per se. But I think the single parent phenomenon is a real issue. And, you know, in the UK we have the same problem, and we look at it, and a big part of it does go back to the way the benefit system rewards single parenthood, and that has to be tackled. You know, we can't bury our heads in the sand, and we have to say we're giving perverse incentives here. We're giving people incentives to bring up kids in non-optimal ways, and we would like to give people incentives to try and stay together and make a two-parent household because that would work better. So I'm all for tinkering with the incentives to try and solve those problems, but I don't think that means we have to go back to an intolerant conservative view of the family, for example.
All right, segment 5, climate and population. 2 quotations, Matt. The first comes from former Vice President Al Gore. I take a deep breath so that I can deliver this as well as he did. 2,000 scientists in 100 countries engaged in the most elaborate, well-organized scientific collaboration in the history of humankind, producing a consensus that we will face a string of terrible catastrophes unless we deal with global warming, close quote. The second quotation comes from your own fine self in the Rational Optimist, quote, the extreme climate outcomes are so unlikely that they do not dent my optimism one jot. Matt Ridley, how dare you?
Well, I think this is like previous scares we've heard. Yes, it's real. There's an element of, I mean, there's no doubt that our carbon dioxide emissions are changing the climate. Mm-hmm. But if you go into the science properly and examine it in all the details, and you take what those 2,000 scientists are writing to each other and not what people are saying that they're saying, then there's no evidence that this is either accelerating at an unprecedented rate or that it's going to reach a very dramatic level of warmth. The evidence to me is very persuasive that we have a high probability of a small warming and a low probability of a big warming. Now, actually, that's what those 2,000 scientists say. That's what the IPCC says. It just says we need to plan for that small probability, and that's where the argument is. And I perfectly accept that we need to have an argument about how small a possibility we need to take drastic measures for. I just think that at the moment we are rushing into measures that are doing real ecological harm and real economic harm. Biofuels would be a classic example, which have minimal benefits even if we are facing one of these small probabilities of a catastrophic event. So I think we've just got to be very much more careful to look at the costs and the benefits. Otherwise, we might find in 50 years' time that we have, as I put it, put a tourniquet round our neck to prevent a nosebleed.
Our neck, around the neck of Western Europe and the United States. The Chinese will not put up with this for a moment.
Well, that's another point, is that, I mean, in practical political terms, the idea of telling 2 billion Asians that they can't use the route to prosperity that we used is unrealistic.
Population. I said I'd like to return to population. Once again, the City Journal's Stephen Malanga, quote, Ridley mostly ignores the substantial problems that economists and demographers see in birth rates that have fallen below replacement level, notably a rapidly aging population, which creates an increasing dependence of pensioners on a shrinking labor force, declining national productivity, and so forth. You note, he gives you credit, you note that in the United States, the population sinks during the birth rate rather, but then it bounces back to replacement levels. Quoting Stephen Malanga again, but that equilibrium in the United States is so unusual that most demographers consider the United States a startling exception to the worldwide trends, close quote. Russia is dying, Europe is hollowing itself out, China will grow old before it grows rich. To which Matt Ridley replies.
I reply that, well, at least we've got the argument away from panicking about population growth.
And that is progress.
Because 10, 20 years ago, and still in a lot of places, people go on about exponential, uncontrolled population growth. It ain't happening. It's slowing down. Population growth globally has gone from 2% to 1% in my lifetime. It's going to hit 0% sometime between 2050 and 2075 by the look of it, but, things could change. So now we should worry. He's right about what that means in terms of a rapidly aging population in some parts of the world. And that is an issue. We're going to have fewer working people to pay for the benefits that support older people. But in a sense, I'm just simply saying that, yes, the aging population and the declining birth rate are issues, but they're a lot easier to deal with than the exploding population we thought we were going to have to deal with.
We keep coming back, or I keep coming back to, if the news is so good, why is everybody whinging and whining so much? And I'm just wondering, Mark Stein, for example, would argue that the low birth rate in Europe is tied to, reflective of, a loss of civilizational self-confidence. It almost seems as though there's an argument, but since it's occurring to me for the first time right now, I will probably put it in a ham-fisted way, that if only Europeans could all read the Rational Optimist,
they'd have more babies.
They'd have more children. They'd say things aren't so grim after all. Do you think there may be something to that?
I mean, you'd have to get at the Japanese too, of course, because they have an even lower birth rate in some ways. I'm not persuaded entirely that it's a loss of civilizational self-confidence. I think, in a way, it's a sort of it's a sign of how comfortable we are about our individual futures, that we don't feel we have to have lots of babies to support us and lots of babies in case one dies and things like that. So in some ways it's a sign of complacency, if you like, or comfort.
Matt, we're nearly out of time, alas. Here's my final question. Americans today are still reeling from financial crisis, recession. Quite learned journals are using the term the new normal, that we may have to get used to a much lower rate of economic growth, the whole feeling that we may have to settle into, or that what happened to Britain in the 50s, the loss of empire, that somehow or other China is eclipsing us in all kinds of ways. If you could offer 2 sentences of advice to Americans and their leaders, what would you say?
I would say openness. I would say the secret is surely to recapture what you've been so good at over the last 2 centuries, and that is to be open to the world, both in terms of people and ideas and goods and services. That's what got you great, was openness within your borders and openness outside your borders.
Matt Ridley, author of The Rational Optimist. Thank you so much. A pleasure.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us.